Fellow cardboarders, welcome back. It was high time that I shared my Nethroi EDH deck, which we voted on the channel about 4 weeks ago. Very quick about the voting. On this channel every couple of weeks I propose some deck ideas I have and let the channel vote. Last time we voted for Atraxa Saga Tribal, and this time we landed on Modular and 0-0 Nethroi on the front. 18 votes came in, very nice. We increased the amount of voters from last time. So let's keep it going and let's try to surpass 20 voters for our next vote, which will be up with this video. So after this video, do go check out the community tab and vote for one of the new deck ideas. Nethroi was a really close vote. It won with 33%, just one vote away from Najal winning. Captain Rex Nebula was just behind that one, and Target Tribal also was just behind that one. So very close call here, but in the end we settled on Nethroi. If those deck ideas interest you and you would like to build them, feel free to do. Send me your ideas and suggestions. I can't build all decks obviously, but I will leave the option open for me to build any of the other decks. So now, without further ado, let's start this segment of Think Outside the Deck Box. And we're going to begin with looking at the commander. I have this alternate art here, which I really liked from all the 3 arts that were available, even though I'm not a big Godzilla fan, and I don't even know what this is, but I really like the art style on this one. So this one has Mutate, which is the main focus of this deck, using his Mutate ability. The Death Touch lifelink is a very nice addition, so very useful, and what we're gonna abuse in this deck as we're building a Modular and 0-0 Tribal is that we're gonna always reanimate our whole graveyard when we mutate him. And I played this deck a couple of times. I already switched out some cards and made changes and adjustments. It's still not perfect, but I'm just sharing it now so you see where I'm at, and if you want to build it, you can take my idea and even improve it. If you have improvements for this deck, do leave them in the comments for the others, or for me if I haven't seen or considered a card. Obviously I don't know all the cards, and I will comment on your comment so we can have a nice discussion together. So what we hope is that no one removes the creature we want to mutate on, so that we get the trigger out of him. Otherwise he just flops onto the battlefield and doesn't reanimate anything. But we also have cards to deal with that, so with that we can sacrifice him again or the like, so we could try again to mutate him. I sorted the deck into different piles, so this is our land pile, our creature pile, our ramp pile, our card draw pile, removal, and the rest of the deck. And I'll just go through the different piles and we're gonna look at what I put in and why I put them in. So the deck's idea is to put in as many 0-0 creatures as we can. There will be a couple of exceptions, which I will talk about in a moment. But first of all, let's look at the nice modular creatures. I think there is not much to say about them, besides them not being humans, so Nethroi can mutate onto them, and they come into play as 1/1s or 2/2s, depending on how high the modular is. We're trying to mill as many creatures into our graveyard before we mutate our Nethroi onto one of them. If some of them die, we can put their counters onto another artifact creature. I do not own all the Arcbound creatures. The Ravager is still missing. I didn't trade for anyone and I just didn't want to buy one yet. I want to try out the deck first a little more before I know that I want to keep the deck around for longer. So I just built it with all the cards I had in my home and tried to make it as good as possible. This one is a nice one to mutate on, giving Nethroi some flying abilities. Also the haste one is very nice, and the fear one. The Reclaimer is also good for saving some of your artifact cards from your graveyard if they might gonna be exiled. I put in 1 Clockwork Creature. In my vote I wrote that I would put more in, but I just saw so many better 0/0 creatures that I just left this one in here and put in more useful creatures. Since the Clockworks are a slowly dying creature type, losing a counter whenever they attack or block, this one is the best one probably, who can give itself a couple +1/+1 counters by tapping and dealing damage whenever they are removed. This one is probably a better modular creature since it can put the +1/+1 creatures onto any creature. So this one is better than the normal worker, who can only give its counters to an artifact creature, but the Iron Apprentice can put it onto any creature. Costs the same and enters with 1 counter. What I added instead of more Clockwork creatures were graft creatures, since I realized the graft ability is just so useful, being able to use the counters those graft creatures have when they enter the battlefield and put them onto other creatures which I want to have bigger or have +1/+1 counters on if they don't have any or gain any when they enter the battlefield, so that I can regenerate any of the +1/+1 creatures. For example, my Nethroi, if someone wants to remove it and I want to keep it around, or any other important +1/+1 counter creature. So this one gives kind of like Death Touch. This one gives Trample, which could be important if my Nethroi gets really big and I want to deal a whole bunch of commander damage. This one gives Reach, which also saved me a couple of times because there are not many flyers in these colors, which are 0/0s. So I added this guy. This one is just a cute boy for the beginning and can graft onto bigger creatures, which are more important at some point. And then we have the Spike Cycle, I'd call them. Let's put those aside for now. There are a couple of these spike creatures in here, which I found very fitting. This one probably is the most popular one, which is also a combo piece. I put a combo in the community section a couple of weeks ago, which is not in the deck, but could be in there actually. We could put Archangel of Thune in there for an infinite combo. I don't own one right now, but if someone wanted to pimp this deck, you could put it in. Archangel is not a 0 creature, so we would break the tribe a little. So these spike creatures come into play with counters normally, and you can remove them to put the counters onto other creatures. I think this one doesn't, but this one has the ability and this one as well. And then they have other effects as well, so this one gives you 2 life for removing 1 counter. This one does a fog effect by removing a counter, and this one boosts itself by +2/+2 until end of turn when you remove a counter. And the last one, the black one, is a little outlier since he removes all the +1/+1 counters from all creatures when he enters the battlefield. Now one might say this is a Numbo card, since if I have a lot of +1/+1 creatures on the battlefield, I don't want to play this one, and this is true. The idea is if I reanimate him and a bunch of more creatures, I can use him kind of as a removal for my opponents, and or remove some of the counters on my creatures, since I can stack the enters the battlefield effects as I want them. So if those both would enter the battlefield and I want to keep him around, I would add the +1/+1 counters at a later point, so would put this on top. This one resolves, takes all the counters, and this one enters and gets the counter afterwards. And you would be surprised to see how many people are playing +1/+1 counters when you're not paying attention to it. So the next game, look around and see how useful this guy is, and especially in such a +1/+1 counter deck. And he's a 0/0, so what can you do? You have to put him in, right? So now we're moving on to some big boys. So this one is a 0/0, and he enters the battlefield with 4 counters, and you can double the amount of counters for 4 mana. So this one is just a big Hydra. This one enters the battlefield with counters equal to the creatures in all graveyards, which means if we reanimate him with Nethroi, in this case, he enters the battlefield with counters equal to the amount of creatures in all my enemies' graveyards. This Theros Hydra here is just another big boy which can also escape and can fight, so I put him in. Maybe there are better ones, but I just found him fitting, and he's also 0/0. Pentavus, also very useful. He can split into 1/1 tokens, but can also sacrifice them to put more counters on them, and he's an artifact creature as well, so he also synergizes well with the modular creatures, so ought to include in my eyes, as he's also a 0/0 creature. Krovax I found in my collection, who doesn't seem to be that bad. For 4 mana as a 4/4, he's a vampire, and during the upkeep I have to sacrifice a creature, which could be useful. Keep in mind that I do sacrifice creatures, and he can also give him some flying. And when I sacrifice a creature, he gets a counter. If I don't, which I can also choose, he just loses a counter. This is similar to the green guy from before, the Undergrowth Scavenger, who gets counters equal to the amount of creatures in my enemy's graveyard if I reanimate him with Nethroi. So he hopefully gets like 10 counters or so, and for 3 mana I can remove a counter and reduce a creature's power and toughness by 1 until end of turn. And there will be turns when I don't do much and have a whole bunch of mana open, so during my opponent's turn, just before my turn, I might just put a whole bunch of mana in, remove a couple of counters, and remove some problem creatures from my opponent's board. This one obviously is auto-include in any counter deck in my eyes. The ability to give him more counters and thinning out my deck to get a whole bunch of basic lands is just so useful. And he's a 0/0, so Fertilid, good boy, included. Mindless Automaton, also great guy who can remove 2 counters and to draw a card. With the modular creatures, this guy is just bonkers. He draws a whole bunch of cards, and at some point I can just let him die and reanimate him again, get a bunch more counters on him. Can also discard cards to get more counters on here, so if I want to put some more creatures from my hand into the graveyard to reanimate for a later point, that is also a useful ability. This one is one of the greater cards in this deck, since I will have a whole bunch of +1/+1 counter creatures, and this one gives all of them menace. And since this deck is a creature focused deck, it will win at some point with creature damage or commander damage, so this guy is just very useful in my eyes. Slurk, also very useful, who gives all my creatures +1/+1 counters whenever a 1/1 counter creature dies. And he even enters the battlefield with some counters, so very useful, and he's just a 0/0. The Elder I added just recently into my deck, since I didn't have him until now. He does not have +1/+1 counters, but is as big as I have different colors among my permanents, and then he's a mana boy. So I found him very useful, and he's a 0/0. I think lastly Multani, also a creature without +1/+1 counters, but he's as big as I have lands in my graveyard, which will happen since we do have mill cards in this deck and on the battlefield as well. So he's just a big reach trample boy. Now, we are breaking the 0/0 tribal with just a handful of cards, since they were, in my eyes, just a little too good to pass on. And if you're building this deck, you might even want to move away even more from the 0/0 tribe, but be still able to call it a 0/0 tribe, just because it will be the majority of creatures. So the Forgotten Ancient is just, in my eyes, an auto-include in any counter deck. He gets +1/+1 counters when anyone casts a spell, even me. And at the beginning of my upkeep, I can distribute the counters onto any of my creatures from him. And I can, for example, make my Nethroi immensely big. We also included the Champion of Lamhold, who gets bigger whenever a creature enters, and when Nethroi reanimates her, she's like a 10/10 right from the beginning, and my whole board is probably unblockable for most of my opponents. And lastly, another 1/1 creature, the Hermit Druid, which is just... this guy just does work. He fills up my graveyard with a whole bunch of creatures, makes sure I always hit my land drops, so he always gets a basic land, and so I just had to include him. So these are my 3 creatures that are not 0/0s. You could maybe make another exception kind of rule by saying it is a 0/0 tribal deck by only including 10 power in total as a rule, so that Nethroi can always reanimate your graveyard, irrelevant how many creatures are in there, since your deck only has 10 power. So that would be another possibility which I am thinking of adding, but then I would have to see which creatures are actually worth it. If I would, for example, put in an Archangel of Thune, which is I think a 3/3, just to have this infinite combo in there. I don't know if I need it though. So this is a kind of like janky fun deck, as you might have already noticed. But I do love unique decks, that's why I built it. So I think we're gonna go through the lower row now. Let's look at my ramp. I already had a video about Songs of the Damned. If you haven't seen it, do watch it. Beautiful card in this deck. My graveyard will always be filled, and I get a whole bunch of mana, and with this mana I can cast my commander even faster, or when he gets too expensive I can cast him again. The statuary I still kept in, since I have I think like 20 artifacts in here, plus or minus, so I found it still very useful. It is a mana rock by itself, and I will probably use it mostly to cast my commander, or maybe some creature cards I want to hard cast if I don't have any other way of getting them out. So yeah, this one will stay in there. If I go away further from the artifact idea, I will probably remove that one, but then it would also be no longer a modular deck. Soaring, nothing to say here, very useful. 3 visits, also not much to say. Ashnod's Altar, just to recycle my creatures again, get a whole bunch of mana and cast my Nethroi again, since I have a whole bunch of artifacts and this one can just cast them. And some Mana Rock, which also gives me colorless, but the second effect is not to be underestimated, since this one can make any of my creatures, for example, into an artifact. So if my Nethroi is not an artifact, I can make him into an artifact, and if my modular creatures die or if I sacrifice them, I can instantly give him a whole bunch of counters through my modular creatures. So I found this a good inclusion. This applies obviously to any other creature, it doesn't only have to be Nethroi, but I found it very useful to be able to make non-artifacts into artifacts. Some card draw. The Anvil is a very undervalued card, I think. It is getting expensive. I think it's like 30-40 bucks now. So if you don't have your copy yet, maybe you want to get yours. Everyone draws an extra card at the beginning of their turn and then discard one of the 2 cards that they just drew. And this one starts filling up my graveyard from the beginning. So I play this at turn 2, maybe with Soaring even turn 1, and everyone already loves me. Like, I'm helping them to draw cards, they discard their unimportant cards, and I'm starting to fill up my graveyard to be able to just explode with Nethroi at some point. So this one just had to be in here. Skull Clamp, nothing much to say. My 1/1s I just sacrifice into this clamp and get 2 cards out of. Sylvan Library, just to get through my deck a little faster. Greater Good is just beautiful. Even if I draw less cards than I'm discarding, I'm filling up my graveyard so hard with this one. So I could just sacrifice my whole board, fill up my graveyard a whole bunch, and then cast my commander again. And this one just was an auto-include. Like, in the worst case, I have like at least 5/5/6/6 commander and draw 5 to 6 cards. Most of the times I have like a 10/10 or 20/20 creature on the board, so this one will always draw me a whole bunch of cards. Fill up my graveyard if I don't have a maximum hand size, and I'm not even sure if I'm playing a Reliquary Tower, since I do want to discard cards. Since I'm playing an artifact deck, I thought this spot removal of removing a creature from the game for just 1 mana, better Path to Exile, better Swords to Plowshares, so since I'm playing an artifact deck, I think I had to just include this patch. I am giving away elephants, so auto-include in my eyes in any deck, just to be able to remove any permanents. Aura shards had to be in there. If I put like 10 creatures during 1 turn onto the battlefield, I can just remove all the artifacts and enchantments on the whole board for my opponents. Very useful. All is dust with all the artifacts I'm playing. I don't mind sacrificing some of my colored cards, and if I sacrifice creatures, I can reanimate them again. Attrition makes my creatures into little bombs. I can sacrifice a creature and pay a black to destroy any black creature on the battlefield and reanimate them later probably. And whenever a creature dies, these both enchantments I'm playing, my opponents also sacrifice a creature. So if they do start taking apart my board again, I flash this one in, or hopefully have this one on the board already, and they also have to sacrifice some stuff when they want to remove my stuff. We are very far ahead in the deck. Last pile before we get to the lands. This is just beautiful mill, just had to be included, nothing much to say here. Birthing Pod, just getting the most valuable creatures out of my deck, sacrificing them, being able to reanimate them later, very useful. And just the artwork was so beautiful, I just had to include it. This card I think is still a little underplayed. It's a very new card, maybe not many people know it. It has Hideaway 5. And at the beginning of the upkeep I can mill 3, and when I have 20 or more cards in my graveyard I can play the Hideaway card without paying the mana costs. And this just stays around and keeps milling, so very useful. Another undervalued card, do play Tortured Existence in any reanimate kind of deck. Discarding creature cards and swapping them out for better creature cards in your graveyard is just so beautiful. Survival of the Fittest. I put this one in here from our last mail time video. Just being able to discard creature cards and getting the important ones out of the deck is just so beautiful. Had to be included. I think this is Crawling Sensation. This one mills 2 cards at the beginning of my upkeep, and whenever it hits, or whenever any land hits the graveyard on my side at any point once each turn, I get a 1/1 insect onto the battlefield. So I found this quite nice, getting some little blockers or even mutate targets if I'm desperate is just very useful. This one is in here to save my graveyard if someone plays a Bojuka Bog, which did already happen. I sadly didn't have it out at that point, but I wished. This one just saves my graveyard and the important creatures in there, and also gives me 5 life, shuffles itself into the library as well, so I keep it around. Diabolic Intent could fetch me this one, but maybe I want to fetch myself any other important card. I sacrifice a creature and then I have a Demonic Tutor. These two most of the time are here for some MDFC action. If I do want to play the first one here, it does put a creature onto the battlefield with +1/+1 counters, so I found it also very fitting, but most of the time it is a forest or green mana source. And this one saves a creature from dying if I really want to save it or play it as a black land. And Ozolith has to be in here, obviously. Fun fact, if I did understand it correctly, I can take the +1/+1 counters from my modular creatures. Instead of putting them onto an artifact creature, put them on here, and then these counters can be put on any non-artifact creature as well. So I found this a very nice replacement effect to get the counters where I actually want them. So yeah, that's why I included them. And if there is a board wipe, obviously I'm saving all the counters on here to make a wonderful big creature. The animation module is also very underplayed in my eyes. This one should be in any +1/+1 counter deck. You can pay 1 to get a server token whenever you're putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature, or on any permanent generally, also Ozolith. So in that case, and for 3 you can tap it to choose a permanent or player and give that permanent or player another counter of the kind it already has on it. So if it is a +1/+1 counter, it triggers the first ability again, which is very beautiful. Lastly, the lands, and this is where I say thank you everyone for watching and staying till the end. Let's look what we have here. We have a whole bunch of basic lands. This is 5 plains. We have, let's see, 6 basic swamps and 7 beautiful Mercadian Masks forests. We have a fetch land and a triome. Obviously, if you want to maximize the efficiency of the deck, you also play more fetch lands, you play shock lands. I just had them in other decks and I didn't want to pick them out. So you could make this mana base even more perfect, obviously, but there are some nice pieces in here. Some removal. This one had to be in here for proliferation, so if you have too much mana, you just proliferate for 4, all your 1/1 creatures. This one ramps your game ahead 1 turn, very useful. This one I also had to play since I'm playing so many colorless mana cost cards. Indestructible colorless land. This one gets 2 also non-basic lands, just for your information, onto the battlefield tapped, so you could fetch yourself some shocks or triomes. The Valoras Stronghold is very useful in this deck to be able to save a creature from maybe being exiled. But also if Nethroi is already out and maybe the Hermit Druid was destroyed with a single target removal, you can just put him back on the library again and draw him. Very useful in this deck, and the price has come quite down, so if you want to get yourself a copy, maybe now is the time. Being able to sacrifice stuff, very useful, we already talked about that. Some Bojuka Bog action, I think every black deck should play Bojuka Bog just to be able to deal with graveyard decks like this. Obviously, some MDFC land, it's white on the backside, Command Tower, a Fable Passage, Filter action, and lastly this wonderful Riftstone portal, which I accidentally mill, and then all my lands are green and white as well to their other types. So being able to tap for green and white is just very beautiful, and being able to discard this card or mill it with the other cards is just a very nice addition. I think decks that play these colors and with the milling ability should add this card in their decks. But now I want to hear from you guys what you think about how I built this deck. Are there other creatures, cards you would include in this deck? Don't forget to leave your vote in the community tab. I wish you a wonderful day and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.